They assumed the quiet girl with downcast eyes would crumble when the workshop tools came out. When Tyler Jackson held up those industrial metal cutters and whispered what he planned to do to her fingers, one by one they expected tears, begging, maybe even fainting. What they didn't expect was the slight smile that crossed Mia Chen's lips, or the way she shifted her weight so subtly that none of them noticed. You see, there are some mistakes in life that teach you lessons. And then there are mistakes so catastrophic, so blindingly stupid, that they rewrite everything you thought you knew about power, fear, and what happens when you corner the wrong person. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Riverside, Colorado, like smoke from a dying fire. Lincoln High School emerged from the fog, its red brick facade worn by decades of mountain weather and teenage dreams. For most students walking through those front doors, it was just another Tuesday in October. For Mia Chen, it was day 14 of trying to become invisible. She moved through the East Wing hallway with the practiced anonymity of someone who had learned that attention, any attention, was dangerous. Her black hair fell like a curtain across half her face, and she kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum beneath her worn sneakers. The backpack slung over her shoulder contained nothing remarkable, just textbooks, a few notebooks, and a small wooden medallion her mother had given her years ago. What it didn't contain was any sign of the life she'd left behind in Denver, or the secrets that lived in her muscle memory. The hallway buzzed with the familiar symphony of high school chaos. Locker doors slammed like gunshots. Conversations overlapped in a dozen different pitches. And underneath it all thrummed that particular energy that comes when 300 teenagers are forced into close proximity before 9 in the morning. Mia had learned to read these rhythms in her previous schools, to navigate the invisible territories that every teenager understands instinctively. There were the popular corners where Tyler Jackson and his crew held court, the neutral zones, where the theater kids and band students mixed freely, and the forgotten spaces where people like her could exist without commentary. But even in those forgotten spaces, she felt the weight of observation. Not the casual glances that every new student endures, but something more focused, more calculating. Tyler Jackson had been watching her since her first day, and his attention carried the particular quality of a predator sizing up potential prey. She'd seen that look before, in Denver, in Phoenix before that, in all the towns where her father's work had taken them. Some things, apparently, were universal. Tyler stood 6 feet tall, with the kind of athletic build that came from genetics and a personal trainer his father paid for. His blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes always name brand, and his smile always seemed to contain just a hint of cruelty. He was the kind of boy who had never heard the word no applied to anything he actually wanted, and who had learned early that rules were suggestions that didn't apply to people like him. His father owned Jackson Industries, the construction company that had built half of Riverside's newer developments, and that family name opened doors, silenced complaints, and generally made unpleasant things disappear. Derek Mills flanked Tyler's left side like a faithful shadow. Where Tyler was calculating, Derek was simply mean. He had the thick build of someone who lifted weights to intimidate rather than improve, and his eyes held the flat quality of someone who enjoyed causing pain. His family ran a local auto parts store, which made them comfortable but not wealthy, and Derek seemed to burn with resentment over that distinction. He channeled that anger into absolute loyalty to Tyler, as if proximity to real power might somehow transfer to him. Austin Reed completed the trio, taller than both Tyler and Derek, with the kind of wiry strength that came from years of manual labor. His father worked construction for Tyler's dad, and Austin himself had been doing summer jobs on Jackson Industries sites since he was 14. He spoke less than the other two, but moved with a particular intensity that made people step aside in hallways. There was something in his eyes that suggested he was always one small provocation away from violence, and everyone at Lincoln High had learned to give him space. The three of them had claimed the area near the auto shop as their territory, which made sense given that it was the most isolated part of the school, furthest from administrative offices and teacher supervision. The auto shop itself was a throwback to an earlier era of education, when schools still believed in preparing students for trades rather than just college. It contained all the tools of serious mechanical work, from hydraulic lifts to welding equipment to industrial cutting tools that could slice through metal like butter. More importantly, from Tyler's perspective, it contained numerous opportunities for privacy and creative intimidation. Mia had been avoiding that part of the school entirely, but her schedule finally betrayed her. Mr. Peterson's advanced physics class was located in the science wing, which required walking past the auto shop corridor. She'd been timing her movements carefully, arriving just as the bell rang to minimize her exposure, but today she mistimed it. Today, she rounded the corner into the east wing, just as Tyler and his crew were emerging from the auto shop, and the collision of their gazes felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Tyler's smile widened as he spotted her, and he said something quietly to Derek and Austin that made them both chuckle. It wasn't a friendly sound. Mia felt her stomach clench with familiar dread, but she kept walking, eyes down, hoping they would let her pass. Hope, as she'd learned repeatedly, was often a luxury she couldn't afford. Well, Tyler's voice carried clearly down the hallway, pitched just loud enough that other students could hear. Look what we have here, Denver's finest export, gracing us with her presence. Mia didn't respond, didn't slow down, didn't look up. Experience had taught her that engagement, any engagement, was what they wanted. Feed the beast and it grows stronger. Starve it and sometimes, it moves on to easier prey. But Tyler Jackson was not the type to be ignored. He stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop or walk into him. His smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone cold. "I'm talking to you, new girl," he said, his voice dropping to a register that only she could hear. "Around here, when someone speaks to you, you answer. It's called manners. Maybe they do things differently in whatever hole you crawled out of. But in Riverside, we believe in respect." Mia finally looked up, meeting his gaze for just a moment before looking away. In that brief contact, she saw something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't just casual bullying or territorial posturing. There was genuine malice in Tyler's eyes, the kind of focused hatred that comes from someone who has identified a target and committed to destroying it. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I didn't hear you." Derek snorted with laughter. "Didn't hear him, right. Maybe you need to get your ears checked, Denver girl." "Maybe she needs to get a lot of things checked," Austin added, his voice carrying an edge that made the hair on Mia's arms stand up. Tyler held up a hand, silencing his friends. No, she apologized. "That's progress." He leaned closer, and Mia caught a whiff of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded her of the garage where her father worked. Motor oil and metal shavings and the particular scent of machinery pushed beyond its limits. "Here's the thing, though," Tyler continued, his voice so quiet now that she had to strain to hear it. "Apologies are just words, and words are cheap. Around here we believe in action, in proving that you understand your place." The hallway had gone strangely quiet around them. Other students continued to move past, but they gave the group a wide berth, their conversations muted, their eyes carefully averted. This was clearly a familiar scene, a drama that had played out before with other victims, and everyone knew their role. The unspoken rule seemed to be, don't look, don't interfere, don't become the next target. "What do you want?" Mia asked, hating the way her voice shook slightly. Tyler's smile widened. "Smart question. See, I've been thinking about you, Denver girl, wondering what your story is. Wondering why someone would move to our little town right in the middle of a semester. Wondering what they might be running from." Mia's heart hammered against her ribs. How could he know? Her father had been so careful, had made sure all their paperwork was in order, had even taken a new job under a slightly modified version of his name. There was no way Tyler could know about Denver, about what had happened there, about why they'd had to leave in the middle of the night with nothing but what they could fit in their car. "I'm not running from anything," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Sure you're not," Derek chimed in. "That's why you sneak around like a ghost. That's why you never talk to anyone. That's why you look like you're ready to bolt every time someone looks at you sideways." Austin stepped closer, and Mia caught the scent of cigarettes and something medicinal on his breath. "My dad knows your dad," he said conversationally. "Says he's working over at Chen's auto repair. Funny thing, though. Shop's been struggling, real struggling. Makes a man wonder how someone affords to just pick up and move to a new town without any guarantees." The blood drained from Mia's face. Her father had been so proud when he'd managed to buy the failing auto shop from its previous owner, had talked about how they could finally stop running, finally build something stable. She hadn't realized how visible that struggle was to the rest of the community. "Leave my father out of this," she said, and for the first time there was steel in her voice. Tyler's eyebrows rose with interest. "Oh, would you look at that? The mouse has claws." He exchanged glances with Derek and Austin. "That's good. That's very good. Shows you care about something other than yourself." The bell rang, sharp and urgent, and students began moving more quickly toward their classrooms. But Tyler made no move to leave, and neither did his friends. They formed a loose semicircle around Mia, effectively blocking her path to the science wing. "Here's what's going to happen," Tyler said, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a small child. "You're going to meet us in the auto shop after school today, 3:30 sharp. We're going to have a little conversation about respect, about community, about what it costs to be part of Riverside." "I have to get to class," Mia said desperately. "Class can wait," Derek said. "This is more important, much more important," Austin agreed. "See, we've been talking, and we think you need to understand something fundamental about how things work here. About what happens to people who think they can just show up and take from our community without giving anything back." Tyler reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few quick taps, he pulled up a photo and held it so Mia could see the screen. It was a picture of her father, taken through the window of the auto shop. He was bent over an engine, completely absorbed in his work, unaware that he was being watched. "Nice picture, right?" Tyler said casually. "I've got lots more where that came from. Amazing what you can see with the right vantage point. Amazing what kinds of accidents can happen in a shop full of dangerous machinery." Mia's breath caught. The threat was unmistakable, and the casual way Tyler delivered it made it even more terrifying. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her father, about the life they were trying to build, about everything they had left. "You can't threaten him," she whispered. "I'm not threatening anyone," Tyler said, his voice full of mock innocence. "I'm just pointing out facts. Auto shops are dangerous places. Lots of things can go wrong. Equipment can malfunction. Tools can slip. Accidents happen all the time." He put his phone away and stepped back, giving her just enough space to breathe but not enough to feel safe. 3:30, he repeated. "Auto shop. Don't keep us waiting, Denver girl. And don't even think about bringing anyone else or telling any teachers. Because if you do, well..." He shrugged. "Like I said, accidents happen." The three of them walked away, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Mia stood frozen for a long moment, her mind racing. She thought about her father, bent over that engine, trusting and vulnerable. She thought about the life they were.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Trying to build here, how desperately they both needed this to work. She thought about her mother's voice, calm and steady even in the hospital bed. "Promise me, Mia. Promise me you'll only use what I taught you to protect the people you love." The second bell rang, sharp and insistent, jolting her back to the present. She was late for physics, but that seemed like the least of her problems now. As she hurried toward the science wing, her mind was already working, calculating, planning. She had 6 hours until 3:30, 6 hours to figure out how to protect her father without destroying everything they'd worked for. What Tyler Jackson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Mia Chen had been preparing for moments like this her entire life. Her mother hadn't just taught her karate as a hobby or a form of exercise. She had taught her because she understood, with the clarity that comes from personal experience, that the world contains people who mistake kindness for weakness, silence for compliance, and fear for surrender. And sometimes, those people need to be educated about the difference. The afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows of Chen's auto repair, casting long shadows across the concrete floor scattered with tools and engine parts. The smell of motor oil and metal shavings hung thick in the air, mixing with the faint scent of coffee from the ancient pot that David Chen kept brewing in the corner office. The garage held 4 cars in various states of repair, from Mrs. Patterson's ancient Honda Civic that needed a new transmission to the sleek BMW that belonged to one of the Jackson Industries executives, a man who paid his bills on time but never made eye contact when he picked up his car. David Chen moved between the vehicles with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been working with his hands his entire life. At 42, he still possessed the wiry strength that had carried him through 2 decades as a mechanic, first in Denver working for other people's shops, then briefly as a partner in what he thought would be his big break, and now here in Riverside, trying to build something that belonged entirely to him and his daughter. His black hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and his hands bore the permanent stains and small scars that marked anyone who made their living repairing the mechanical failures of others. The shop itself was a testament to careful budgeting and stubborn determination. David had bought it from its previous owner for a price that seemed too good to be true, and had spent the first 3 months discovering exactly why that was the case. The hydraulic lift needed constant adjustment, the air compressor had a slow leak that he couldn't quite locate, and the electrical system dated back to the Carter administration. But the bones of the place were solid, the location was decent, and most importantly, it was his. After years of working for other people, of having his suggestions ignored, and his expertise undervalued, David Chen finally had a place where his word was law, and his reputation would rise or fall based on his own efforts. The transition hadn't been easy. Moving to Riverside meant leaving behind the few connections they'd built in Denver, the teachers who had begun to understand Mia's quiet intelligence, the neighbors who had helped them through the worst days after his wife's death. It meant starting over in a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, where family names carried weight that went back generations, and where being an outsider was a designation that could take years to shed. But David had been optimistic in those first weeks. Riverside needed a good mechanic, and he was very good at what he did. He could diagnose engine problems by sound, could rebuild a transmission blindfolded, and had the kind of instinctive understanding of machinery that couldn't be taught in trade schools. More importantly, he was honest in a profession where honesty was often in short supply. He didn't invent problems that didn't exist, didn't pad his bills with unnecessary parts, and he stood behind his work with a guarantee that actually meant something. The first month had been promising. Word had spread about the new mechanic who could fix things other shops couldn't, who charged fair prices and completed jobs when he said he would. The appointment book had started filling up, and for the first time since leaving Denver, David had allowed himself to believe that this move might actually work out. Then reality had begun to assert itself in small but persistent ways. The parts suppliers who had promised competitive pricing suddenly found reasons to add surcharges and delivery fees. The local business association had welcomed him with polite smiles and vague promises of support that never materialized into actual referrals. Customers who had seemed enthusiastic about his work began taking longer to pay their bills, and some stopped coming altogether without explanation. It took David longer than it should have to understand the pattern. Riverside operated on networks of relationship and influence that went back decades, and Jackson Industries sat at the center of many of those networks. Brad Jackson didn't just own a construction company, he sponsored the high school football team, sat on the town council, and had business relationships with half the merchants in town. When Brad Jackson decided that the new auto shop was taking business away from his friend who owned the established garage across town, Word spread through those networks like ripples across still water. The pressure was never overt, never anything that could be challenged directly. It was simply a gradual cooling of enthusiasm, a subtle redirection of recommendations, a quiet suggestion that perhaps the established shop with its proven track record might be a safer choice for important repairs. David found himself working longer hours for fewer customers, stretching every dollar, slowly watching his dream of independence turn into a daily struggle for survival. But he never let Mia see his worry. Every evening when she came home from school, he would greet her with a smile and ask about her day, and if she noticed the tension in his shoulders or the way he studied the account books late into the night, she was kind enough not to mention it. They had learned to protect each other in small ways, to carry their individual burdens without adding to the weight the other person was already bearing. Mia walked through the garage door just as David was finishing up the brake job on the Honda Civic, his shirt stained with grease, and his face showing the satisfaction that came from solving a particularly stubborn problem. She moved quietly, as had become her habit, and settled onto the old wooden stool near his workbench to watch him finish up. This was their routine, this quiet companionship at the end of each day, and it had become precious to both of them in ways they didn't need to articulate. "How was school?" David asked, wiping his hands on a rag and giving her his full attention. "Fine," Mia replied, which had become her standard answer to that question. She studied her father's face, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes and the way his smile didn't quite reach them anymore. "Busy day?" "Not bad," David said, which was his standard response to questions about the business. "Mrs. Patterson's car is finally ready. Should keep her running for another few years if she takes care of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them aware of the conversations they weren't having. Mia didn't mention Tyler Jackson, or the threat hanging over her afternoon. David didn't mention the overdue invoice from Jackson Industries, or the way certain customers had stopped returning his calls. They had both learned that some burdens were best carried alone, at least until sharing them might actually help. The truth was that Mia worried about her father constantly. She could see the stress he tried to hide, could read the signs of financial pressure in the way he counted and recounted the money in the cash register, in the way he lingered over the account books, in the way he'd started buying generic groceries and suggesting they eat more meals at home. She knew that moving to Riverside had been a gamble, that buying the shop had required every dollar they'd saved, plus a loan that kept him awake at night. What she didn't know was exactly how precarious their situation had become. David had been careful to shield her from the worst of it, to maintain the fiction that they were building something stable and sustainable. But the reality was that they were perhaps 2 months away from defaulting on the loan, from losing everything they'd worked for, from having to pack up and run again. The thought of telling Mia that they might have to leave, that he'd failed again, filled him with a dread that was almost physical in its intensity. For her part, Mia carried her own secrets. She didn't tell her father about the isolation at school, about the way certain students looked at her like she was something foreign and potentially dangerous, about the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked past. She didn't mention Tyler Jackson or his friends, didn't describe the way they'd been watching her, testing her boundaries, establishing their dominance through 1,000 small humiliations. Most of all, she didn't talk about the dreams that woke her up at night, dreams where she was back in the dojo with her mother, moving through forms that had once felt like dancing, channeling power and precision that had made her feel invincible. She didn't talk about the way her hands sometimes clenched into fists during particularly difficult days at school, or the way she found herself automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes. Those skills, that knowledge, belonged to a different version of herself, one that she'd promised to keep buried. Her mother had been very clear about that promise. Mia Chen had started training in karate as a college student, initially for fitness and stress relief, but had discovered an aptitude and passion that carried her through 15 years of dedicated practice. She'd earned her black belt through discipline and determination, had even competed in regional tournaments before Mia was born. But she'd also understood the responsibility that came with that knowledge, the way that having the ability to hurt people changed how you moved through the world. "Strength without wisdom is just violence waiting to happen," Sarah had told her daughter during one of their training sessions. The point of learning to fight isn't so that you can fight. It's so that you understand what fighting actually costs. Mia had started training when she was 8, partly because her mother wanted to share something she loved, but mostly because Sarah had recognized something in her daughter's temperament that might benefit from the discipline and focus that martial arts provided. Mia had been an angry child in small ways, quick to frustration, impatient with obstacles, prone to solving problems through force rather than strategy. Karate had taught her patience, had shown her how to channel emotion into precision, had given her tools for controlling both her body and her mind. By the time she was 14, Mia had earned her own black belt through a combination of natural ability, dedicated practice, and her mother's expert guidance. She could break boards with her bare hands, could execute throwing techniques that could disable much larger opponents, and had developed the kind of spatial awareness and reaction time that made her dangerous in ways that most people would never suspect. But more importantly, she had internalized her mother's philosophy about the responsible use of power. The promise had come during Sarah's final hospital stay, when the cancer had made it clear that their time together was measured in days rather than months. Sarah had made Mia repeat it back to her 3 times, had insisted that she understand not just the words but the spirit behind them. Promise me you'll only use what I taught you to protect people who can't protect themselves. Promise me you won't let anger or pride make you into something I wouldn't recognize. Promise me you'll be better than the people who might try to hurt you. Mia had kept that promise for 3 years, through multiple moves and new schools and countless small humiliations. She'd learned to walk away from fights, to absorb insults without responding, to make herself smaller and quieter, when making herself larger might have been easier. The skills her mother had taught her remained sharp through private practice, through forms practiced in empty rooms and techniques drilled into muscle memory, but she'd never used them against another person. Until now, she'd never been forced to consider whether her definition of people who can't protect themselves might include her father. David finished cleaning his tools and locked the cash register, his movements showing the automatic efficiency of someone who'd performed these same tasks thousands of times. The total in the register was smaller than he'd hoped, but not smaller than he'd feared, which he supposed counted as a victory of sorts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new repairs, new opportunities to prove that Chen's auto repair deserved to survive and thrive. "Want to grab some dinner?" he asked Mia. "I was thinking we could try that new pizza place downtown." Mia shook her head. "I'm not really hungry. Maybe I'll just make a sandwich at home." David studied her face more carefully, noting details he'd been too busy to observe before: the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the door, the way her hands rested in her lap like she was consciously preventing them from moving. Something was wrong, something beyond the usual adjustment difficulties of starting at a new school. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. Mia met his eyes for a moment, then looked away. In that brief contact, David saw something that made his stomach clench with worry. Fear. His daughter was afraid of something, and she was trying to hide it from him. "Mia," he said, moving closer and sitting on the workbench so they were at eye level. "Talk to me. What's going on?" For a moment she seemed to waver, seemed to consider telling him everything. About Tyler Jackson and his friends, about the threats and the casual cruelty, about the way she felt trapped between her promise to her mother and her desire to protect the life they were building together. But then she looked around the garage, saw the evidence of how hard he was working, how much this place meant to him, and she made the same choice she'd been making for weeks. "It's just school stuff," she said. "You know how it is being the new kid. It takes time to fit in." David wasn't convinced, but he also understood that pushing too hard might cause her to retreat even further. He'd learned that lesson during the worst months after Sarah's death, when Mia had gone through a period of almost complete silence, communicating in monosyllables and spending most of her time alone in her room. Patience and consistent availability had eventually drawn her back out, and he trusted that the same approach would work now. "Well, if you want to talk about anything, I'm here," he said. "You know that, right?" Mia nodded, and this time her smile seemed more genuine. "I know. Thanks, Dad." They walked home together through the gathering dusk, past the neat houses and well-maintained lawns that characterized their neighborhood. Riverside was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, and kids rode their bikes without supervision, where everyone knew their neighbors and the local newspapers still printed wedding announcements and Little League scores. It should have felt safe, should have felt like the fresh start they'd both been hoping for. Instead, as they approached their small apartment above the veterinary clinic, Mia found herself scanning the shadows, checking to make sure they weren't being watched. Tyler Jackson's threat echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, constant and insistent. 3:30. Auto shop. Don't keep us waiting. She had 4 hours to figure out what she was going to do. 4 hours to decide whether keeping her promise to her mother was worth risking her father's safety. 4 hours to determine whether there was a way to protect everything she cared about without becoming something her mother wouldn't recognize. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and frowned, his expression shifting from tired contentment to something closer to worry. "What is it?" Mia asked. David hesitated, then showed her the message. It was from Brad Jackson, Tyler's father, and it was brief and to the point. "We need to discuss your lease agreement. My office, tomorrow, at 9 a.m. The apartment suddenly felt very small and very quiet. Mia stared at the message, her mind racing to connect the dots between Tyler's threats and his father's sudden interest in their business arrangement. The timing couldn't be coincidental, which meant that Tyler had more resources at his disposal than she'd realized. This wasn't just about high school politics or teenage cruelty. This was about power, real power, and the ways that people with influence could destroy those without it. "I'm sure it's nothing," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably just routine paperwork, or something." Mia nodded, but she was already thinking ahead to 3:30, already calculating risks and possibilities. Her promise to her mother had been absolute, but it had also been made under different circumstances. Sarah Chen had never anticipated a situation where keeping that promise might cost them everything they'd worked to build. As she got ready for bed that night, Mia found herself moving through the forms her mother had taught her, her body remembering movements that her mind had tried to forget. Each technique was precise and controlled, designed to neutralize threats with minimal force, to protect rather than punish. Her mother had been very clear about the distinction, had drilled into her the difference between self-defense and aggression, between necessary force and excessive violence. But standing in her bedroom, moving through combinations that could disable grown men, Mia wondered if those distinctions would matter to Tyler Jackson and his friends. She wondered if there was a way to protect her father without breaking her promise, or if some promises were meant to be broken when the alternative was losing everything that mattered. Outside her window, Riverside slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, unaware that tomorrow would test everything that Mia Chen had learned about strength, responsibility, and the price of keeping quiet when speaking up might save the people you love most. The auto shop felt different at 3:30 in the afternoon. The normal sounds of Lincoln High had faded to distant echoes, replaced by the hollow silence that settles over empty buildings. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the workbenches and tool racks. The smell of motor oil seemed stronger in the stillness, mixing with the metallic tang of machinery and something else that Mia couldn't quite identify until she stepped fully into the room and realized it was fear. Her own fear, sharp and immediate, flooding her senses like cold water. Tyler Jackson stood near the center of the shop, leaning casually against a hydraulic lift as if he owned the place. Derek and Austin flanked him on either side, their positions carefully chosen to block the exits. They had changed out of their school clothes into dark jeans and work boots, clothing that wouldn't show stains or damage. The transformation made them look older, more dangerous, like men rather than teenagers playing at intimidation. Mia paused in the doorway, every instinct screaming at her to run. The setup was too deliberate, too isolated, too perfectly designed for violence without witnesses. Mr. Peterson, the shop teacher, had left for the day along with everyone else. The custodial staff wouldn't venture into this wing for another hour. They were completely alone, and Tyler's smile suggested he was very much aware of that fact. "Right on time," Tyler said, checking his phone with exaggerated precision. I appreciate punctuality. Shows respect. Mia forced herself to step into the room, though every muscle in her body resisted the movement. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could taste copper on her tongue, could sense the way her breathing had shifted into the shallow, rapid pattern that preceded either fight or flight. 3 years of carefully maintained control were threatening to dissolve under the weight of genuine terror. "What do you want?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the chaos in her chest. Derek laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Still playing dumb, I love that. Like maybe if she pretends hard enough, this will all just go away." Austin moved slightly to his left, a shift so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Mia's training kicked in automatically, cataloging the change in distance and angle, calculating how it affected potential escape routes. She found herself analyzing the spacing between them, the way they distributed their weight, the tells that revealed who would move first if this escalated beyond words. The realization that she was thinking tactically sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with fear. This was exactly what her mother had warned her about. The way that knowledge of violence could change how you saw the world. Once you started thinking of people as potential threats to be neutralized, once you began calculating which bones to break and which pressure points to target, you were already crossing a line that was very difficult to uncross. Tyler pushed away from the hydraulic lift and began walking in a slow circle around her, like a predator testing its prey for weaknesses. "Here's what I've been thinking," he said conversationally. "Ever since our little chat this morning, I've been wondering about you. About your story. About what makes someone so determined to stay invisible." He completed his circle and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. "So I did some research, asked some questions, made some phone calls." Mia felt the blood drain from her face. There were things about their time in Denver that couldn't bear scrutiny. Events that had forced them to leave everything behind and start over with new names and carefully constructed histories. If Tyler had somehow uncovered those secrets, if he had proof of what had really happened, then this confrontation was about much more than high school dominance games. "Interesting what you can find out when you know where to look," Tyler continued. "Turns out your father isn't just any mechanic. Used to be partners with a guy named Mike Rodriguez in Denver. Successful shop, good reputation, building something real." Derek had moved closer during Tyler's monologue, now standing within arm's reach of Mia's left side. Austin had shifted position as well, closing off her retreat to the door. The formation was professional, the kind of coordinated movement that spoke of planning and practice. These weren't just bullies acting on impulse. They had thought this through. "Funny thing about partnerships, though," Tyler said, his voice taking on a mock sympathetic tone. "Sometimes they end badly. Sometimes one partner decides the other partner is holding him back. Sometimes money goes missing and trust gets broken and people have to leave town very quickly." Mia's hands clenched into fists at her sides before she could stop them. The story Tyler was telling wasn't exactly true, but it was close enough to the real events to be dangerous. Mike Rodriguez had been her father's business partner for 5 years, and David had trusted him completely. Too completely, as it turned out. When Mike started skimming money from the business accounts and using the shop as a front for other activities, David had confronted him privately, hoping to resolve things without destroying their friendship. Mike's response had been to claim that David was the one stealing, that the missing money was evidence of his partner's dishonesty rather than his own. With Mike's cousin working in the local police department and Mike's family having deep roots in their Denver neighborhood, the accusations had stuck. David found himself under investigation for crimes he hadn't committed, watching his reputation dissolve under the weight of whispered suspicions and carefully planted evidence. The truth might have come out eventually, but David couldn't afford to wait for justice to run its course. With Mia's safety potentially at risk and their savings rapidly disappearing into legal fees, he had made the painful decision to walk away from everything they'd built. The move to Riverside wasn't just a fresh start. It was a desperate escape from circumstances that had spiraled beyond his control. "Must have been hard," Tyler said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Losing everything like that. Having to run away in the middle of the night. Starting over with nothing but the clothes on your back. That's not what happened, Mia said, but her voice lacked conviction. The real story was too complicated to explain. Too dependent on context and history that Tyler wouldn't care about anyway. Derek stepped closer, his bulk now blocking her view of the nearest exit. Sure it isn't. Just like your dad isn't desperate enough to do anything to keep this new shop afloat. Just like you're not exactly what everyone thinks you are. Austin had produced something from his pocket, and Mia felt her stomach drop when she realized what it was. Industrial wire cutters, the kind used for heavy electrical work, their blades sharp enough to slice through metal cables. He held them casually, almost carelessly, but there was nothing casual about the way the overhead lights reflected off the cutting edges. "See, here's what I think happened," Tyler said, beginning another slow circle around her. "I think your father got greedy in Denver. I think he took money that didn't belong to him. And I think when he got caught, he ran here to Riverside, thinking he could start over, and no one would be the wiser." The accusation hit like a physical blow, and Mia felt rage flood through her system like molten steel. Her father was the most honest person she knew, had sacrificed everything rather than compromise his principles, had chosen poverty and exile over staying in a situation where his integrity was questioned. To hear Tyler twist that into a story of greed and criminality was almost unbearable. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, and this time her voice carried an edge that made all three boys pause. Tyler's eyebrows rose with interest. "There she is. There's that fire I've been waiting to see." He stopped directly in front of her again, close enough that she could feel his breath on her face. "The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Austin hefted the wire cutters, testing their weight in his palm. "You know what these are used for?" he asked conversationally. "Heavy cables. Thick wire. Sometimes fingers. When people don't cooperate." The threat was explicit now, no longer hidden behind innuendo or implication. Mia's training kicked in automatically, her body shifting into a defensive stance so subtly that none of them noticed. Weight balanced on the balls of her feet, hands loose and ready, breathing deep and controlled. She could feel her mother's presence like a whisper in her mind, reminding her of lessons learned in the safety of the dojo. "Distance and timing," Sarah's voice echoed across the years. "Control the space between you and the threat. Make them come to you on your terms, not theirs." But even as her body prepared for violence, her mind wrestled with the promise she had made. These weren't people who couldn't protect themselves. These were predators, bullies, who had chosen this path and would continue down it unless someone stopped them. Using her skills against them wouldn't be protecting the innocent. It would be participating in the very cycle of violence her mother had taught her to avoid. Tyler seemed to sense her internal struggle, and his smile widened. "You're thinking about fighting back, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes. Part of you wants to try." Derek chuckled, a sound like breaking glass. "Let her try. Might be fun to watch." "Oh, I don't think our new friend wants to fight," Austin said, flexing the wire cutters so their blades caught the light. "I think she's smart enough to know when she's outmatched." Mia's gaze flicked between the three of them, cataloging their positions, their weapons, their likely responses to different scenarios. Austin was the immediate threat with the cutters, but Derek was closer and probably faster. Tyler was the leader, the one calling the shots, but also the one most likely to underestimate her if things went wrong. "What do you want?" she asked again, though she was beginning to understand that the question itself was irrelevant. This wasn't about getting something from her. This was about establishing dominance, about proving that they could take whatever they wanted whenever they wanted it. The specific demands were just window dressing for a more fundamental exercise in power. "Simple," Tyler said. "I want you to understand your place. I want you to acknowledge that everything you and your father have here exists at my discretion. I want you to show proper respect for the natural order of things." He gestured to Austin, who stepped forward with the wire cutters. "Hold out your hand." Mia's blood turned to ice. What? You heard me. Hold out your hand. Palm up. Derek moved to flank her other side, and suddenly she was boxed in with nowhere to retreat. The space between them had collapsed to arm's length, close enough that any movement would trigger immediate retaliation. Austin held the cutters like he knew how to use them, like this wasn't the first time he'd threatened someone with serious injury. Just a little reminder, Tyler said conversationally. Something to help you remember this conversation. Nothing permanent, nothing that won't heal. Just a small price for thinking you could come to our town and take what doesn't belong to you. Mia stared at the wire cutters, her mind racing through possibilities and options. She could break Austin's wrist before he could close the blades, could use his momentum against him to drive him into Derek, could create enough chaos to reach one of the exits. Her training had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation, had given her tools that could turn the tables in seconds. But using those tools would mean revealing abilities that were supposed to remain hidden. It would mean escalating this confrontation into something that couldn't be contained or explained away. Most importantly, it would mean breaking the promise she had made to her mother, the vow that had shaped every choice she'd made for the past 3 years. I can see you thinking, Tyler said, calculating, wondering if there's a way out of this. His voice dropped to a whisper. There isn't. Not unless you want something much worse to happen to your father. The mention of her father sent a spike of pure terror through Mia's chest. The threat was real, backed by the kind of family influence that could destroy lives without legal consequences. Tyler's father controlled construction contracts throughout the region, had political connections that reached into law enforcement and local government. If the Jackson family decided that David Chen was a problem that needed to be solved, they had resources that went far beyond teenage intimidation. Austin stepped closer, the wire cutters now positioned directly over her extended hand. Last chance to cooperate, he said. Make this easy on yourself. Mia looked into his eyes and saw something that chilled her more than the threat of physical pain. Austin was enjoying this. The power, the fear, the complete control over another human being's choices. He wasn't just following Tyler's orders. He was savoring the moment, feeding on her helplessness like it was a drug. Please, she said, hating the way the words sounded but recognizing it as her last chance to avoid violence. Don't do this. Tyler's smile was radiant with satisfaction. There it is. That's what I wanted to hear. Proper respect, proper acknowledgement of how things work here. But Austin didn't lower the cutters. If anything, his grip tightened, and Mia could see the anticipation in his face. He was going to do it regardless of her compliance, was going to hurt her, for the simple pleasure of watching her suffer. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and with it came a clarity that cut through her fear like sunlight through fog. These weren't people who would be satisfied with submission. They weren't interested in her respect or acknowledgement or proper behavior. They wanted to hurt her because hurting people made them feel powerful, and nothing she said or did would change that fundamental truth. The choice wasn't between fighting and cooperation. It was between fighting and being victimized. The wire cutters began to close, their blades moving toward her fingers with deliberate slowness. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, and Mia felt something shift inside her chest, some barrier that had held for 3 years finally cracking under pressure. Her mother's voice whispered across the years, not the lesson about restraint and responsibility, but an earlier teaching from when Mia had been younger and the world had seemed simpler. Sometimes, sweetheart, the most important thing isn't whether you fight, it's whether you choose to fight or let someone else make that choice for you. Mia's hand moved. It moved faster than Austin could track, faster than Derek could react, faster than Tyler could comprehend. One moment she was standing helplessly between them. The next, Austin was on his knees clutching his wrist while the wire cutters clattered across the concrete floor. Her strike had been precise and controlled, targeting the nerve cluster that would cause temporary paralysis without permanent damage, exactly the kind of technique her mother had taught her for disabling weapons without seriously injuring attackers. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Derek stared at his friend in shock. Tyler's mouth hung open in disbelief, and Austin made small whimpering sounds as he tried to restore feeling to his hand. None of them had seen exactly what happened. Mia's movement had been too quick, too economical, too perfect. "What did you do?" Derek demanded, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. There was uncertainty there now, a recognition that the dynamics of the situation had shifted in ways he didn't understand. Mia said nothing. She stood in the same position as before, breathing steadily, her hands loose at her sides. To all appearances, she hadn't moved at all. Only the evidence of Austin's condition suggested that anything had happened, and even that could be explained as some kind of accident or coincidence. Tyler's mind raced to process what he'd witnessed. One moment, Austin had been in complete control, threatening serious injury with professional confidence. The next, he was disabled and helpless, his weapon neutralized, his dominance shattered. The transition had been so quick and subtle that Tyler found himself questioning whether he'd actually seen anything at all. "Lucky shot," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Austin was probably holding those cutters wrong, strained something. But even as he spoke, Tyler was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about Mia Chen. The girl standing before him didn't look different, didn't carry herself with obvious confidence or aggression, but something fundamental had changed. There was a stillness about her now that suggested coiled energy, potential for movement that he couldn't quite quantify but definitely couldn't ignore. Derek helped Austin to his feet, both of them keeping careful distance from Mia as they did so. Austin's wrist was already beginning to swell, and his face had gone pale with pain and shock. The wire cutters lay forgotten on the concrete, their threat neutralized as completely as if they'd never existed. "This isn't over," Tyler said, but the words rang hollow in the echoing space of the auto shop. "Not even close to over." Mia met his gaze directly for the first time since entering the room. When she spoke, her voice was calm and level, carrying no trace of the fear that had dominated her just minutes earlier. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." The three boys left without another word, Austin cradling his injured wrist against his chest, Derek glancing back over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit, Tyler maintaining his swagger, but moving faster than usual toward the exit. Mia remained in the center of the room until their footsteps faded completely, until she was certain they were truly gone. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge what had just happened. She had broken her promise to her mother, had used her training against another person, had chosen violence over restraint when other options might have existed. The knowledge sat like a stone in her chest, heavy with implications she wasn't ready to explore. But she had also protected herself, had prevented serious injury through minimal force, had demonstrated that she wasn't helpless prey for anyone who decided to target her. The wire cutters lay on the concrete as evidence of what might have happened, of the choice between being hurt and fighting back that she'd been forced to make. As she finally moved toward the exit, Mia found herself thinking not of her mother's warnings about violence, but of her father working late into the night, over account books that never seemed to balance. Of the worried lines around his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Of the life they were trying to build together, one careful day at a time. Tyler Jackson and his friends had made their choice when they decided to threaten her family. Now she had made hers. The consequences, whatever they might be, would have to unfold as they would. But as she stepped out of the auto shop and into the fading afternoon light, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Tyler's parting words echoed in her mind, carrying the weight of promises and threats that went beyond high school politics. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real question was what she would do when they came back. Because they would come back, of that she was certain, and next time, they would be prepared for the girl who wasn't quite what she seemed. Jessica Torres had been heading to the art room to retrieve her forgotten portfolio when she heard the commotion from the auto shop. The sound wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, just the subtle shift in voices that suggested something important was happening. Her first instinct was to keep walking, to mind her own business the way everyone at Lincoln High had learned to do when Tyler Jackson and his friends were involved. But something about the tone, something about the particular quality of silence that followed, made her pause outside the partially open door. What she saw through the gap defied easy explanation. Austin Reed was on his knees, cradling his right hand against his chest, like it was broken. Derek Mills stood frozen in apparent shock, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Tyler Jackson was staring at a girl Jessica recognized as the new student, the quiet one who sat alone at lunch and never spoke in class discussions. But the girl didn't look quiet now. She stood in the center of the room with a stillness that somehow suggested coiled energy, like a cat deciding whether to pounce or simply walk away. Wire cutters lay abandoned on the concrete floor, their blades catching the harsh fluorescent light. Jessica's mind struggled to connect the scene before her with any reasonable explanation. Austin was one of the strongest students at Lincoln High, had been lifting weights seriously since middle school, was known for his quick temper and quicker fists. The idea that the small, seemingly fragile new girl could have disabled him was absurd. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Austin was hurt, Tyler was backing toward the exit, and the girl remained exactly where she'd been standing, as if nothing particularly significant had occurred. Jessica found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sound might draw attention to her presence and somehow make her part of whatever had just transpired. Tyler's voice carried clearly in the echoing space of the auto shop. "This isn't over. Not even close to over." The girl's response was so quiet that Jessica had to strain to hear it, but the words sent a chill down her spine. "Yes, it is." There was something in that simple statement, some absolute certainty, that suggested the girl knew exactly what she was saying and exactly what it meant. This wasn't bravado or teenage posturing. This was someone drawing a line and daring others to cross it. Jessica watched the three boys leave, Austin still clutching his hand, Derek glancing back nervously, Tyler maintaining his composure but moving faster than usual. Only when their footsteps had faded completely did she dare to move closer to the doorway. The girl stood alone now in the center of the auto shop, and Jessica could see her shoulders trembling slightly, the first sign of ordinary human reaction to whatever had just occurred. For a long moment, Jessica debated whether to reveal herself. Getting involved in anything connected to Tyler Jackson was dangerous, a lesson she'd learned through careful observation and a few unfortunate direct encounters. Tyler had a long memory for perceived slights and the kind of family influence that could make problems disappear or multiply depending on his mood. Smart students at Lincoln High learned to be invisible when Tyler was around, to avoid drawing his attention in either positive or negative ways. But there was something about the girl's isolation, something about the way she stood alone in that empty room, that reminded Jessica of her own experiences with bullying and helplessness. Not the dramatic movie-style confrontations that made headlines, but the steady erosion of confidence that came from knowing you were targeted, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh humiliations, knowing that the adults who were supposed to protect you either couldn't or wouldn't intervene effectively. Jessica had been in 7th grade when it started for her, a campaign of social destruction orchestrated by Madison Price and her circle of friends. Nothing physical, nothing that left visible marks, just a systematic demolition of her reputation and self-worth that had nearly driven her to transfer schools. The teachers had offered platitudes about building character and rising above adversity. Her parents had suggested she try harder to fit in, as if the problem was her failure to properly navigate social dynamics rather than other people's choice to be cruel. The situation had only ended when Madison's family moved away at the end of 8th grade, taking the primary source of Jessica's torment with them. But the experience had left marks that went deeper than bruises, had taught her lessons about power and vulnerability that she carried with her every day. She understood what it felt like to be targeted, to feel alone, to wonder if anyone cared enough to help when help was desperately needed. The girl in the auto shop was clearly carrying that same weight, that same isolation. And unlike Jessica's situation, this one wasn't going to resolve itself through coincidence or enemy relocation. Tyler Jackson wasn't going anywhere, and his family's influence meant that traditional channels of help were likely to be ineffective or even counterproductive. Jessica stepped through the doorway, her footsteps deliberately loud to announce her presence. The girl spun around, her body shifting into what looked like a defensive posture, before she caught herself and forced her shoulders to relax. Up close, Jessica could see that she was perhaps 16, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog potential threats automatically. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked, keeping her voice gentle and non-threatening. The girls studied her for a moment, clearly debating whether to trust this unexpected witness. "I'm fine," she said finally, but her voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been anything but fine just moments earlier. "I'm Jessica Torres," Jessica said, taking a step closer but maintaining careful distance. "I saw what happened. Well, part of it anyway." The admission hung in the air between them, and Jessica could see the girl calculating the implications. A witness could be protection or additional danger, depending on their intentions and loyalties. In a school where Tyler Jackson's word carried more weight than evidence, having someone see him in a position of weakness could either help or make everything worse. "What did you see?" the girl asked carefully. Jessica considered her answer, understanding that honesty was probably the only path to trust. "I saw Austin on the ground holding his hand. I saw Tyler looking like someone had just rearranged his understanding of the world. I saw you standing exactly where you are now, looking like you belonged there." A ghost of a smile flickered across the girl's face. "I'm Mia Chen." "I know. You're in my English class. You sit by the window and never volunteer answers, even though you obviously know them." Mia's eyebrows rose slightly. "You noticed that? I notice a lot of things, especially when they involve people who don't fit the usual patterns." Jessica gestured toward the abandoned wire cutters, like whatever just happened here. "That's not a usual pattern." Mia followed her gaze to the tools lying on the concrete, and Jessica saw something shift in her expression. Not guilt exactly, but a recognition of consequences that hadn't fully occurred to her in the heat of the moment. Using physical force against Tyler Jackson's group wasn't just self-defense. It was a declaration of war against the unofficial power structure of Lincoln High. "How much trouble am I in?" Mia asked quietly. Jessica considered the question seriously. Tyler's family had money and influence, but they also had a reputation to maintain. Brad Jackson served on the school board and contributed heavily to local charities, positions that required at least a facade of respectability. An open acknowledgement that his son was involved in threatening other students with industrial tools would be problematic for the family image. "Depends on what story Tyler decides to tell," Jessica said. "He could claim you attacked them unprovoked, try to get you suspended or expelled. But that would require explaining why they were all in here with you in the first place, and why Austin was holding wire cutters." Mia nodded slowly, understanding the political calculations involved. "So it becomes his word against mine." "Not just yours," Jessica said. "I saw what I saw. And I'm pretty sure the security cameras caught at least part of it." Both girls looked up at the corners of the room, where small surveillance cameras had been installed the previous year after a series of equipment thefts. The red recording lights blinked steadily, indifferent witnesses to whatever had transpired. "That could help or hurt," Mia said. "Depends on what the video actually shows." Jessica studied Mia's face, noting the way she seemed to be thinking several moves ahead, calculating probabilities and responses with a sophistication that spoke of experience with complex situations. This wasn't a girl who was naive about power dynamics or the ways that truth could be manipulated by people with resources and connections. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica said. "How did you do that to Austin? He's not exactly easy to intimidate." Mia was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "I got lucky," she said finally. He was focused on the cutters, not paying attention to what I was doing. It wasn't a complete answer, and they both knew it. But Jessica sensed that pushing for more details might close down the conversation entirely. Instead, she chose a different approach. "My mom works in social services," she said. "She deals with situations like this all the time. Kids being threatened, families being pressured, people with power using it to hurt people who can't fight back." Mia looked up sharply. "This isn't about social services. This is about high school politics." "Is it?" Jessica asked. "Because from what I could see, Austin wasn't planning to give you a detention or make you run laps. Those wire cutters weren't a prop." The words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing both of them to acknowledge the severity of what had almost occurred. "This wasn't typical bullying," Wasn't the usual teenage cruelty that adults dismissed as character building or inevitable social friction. Austin had been prepared to cause serious physical harm, and Tyler had been prepared to let him do it. "You don't understand," Mia said. "Getting adults involved just makes everything worse. Trust me on that." Jessica heard something in her voice, some echo of previous experience that suggested this wasn't Mia's first encounter with institutional failure. "What happened before?" she asked gently. Mia looked away, her gaze settling on the wire cutters as if they held answers to questions she hadn't learned to ask yet. Nothing that worked out the way it was supposed to. The admission carried weight beyond its simple words, and Jessica felt a surge of recognition. She'd heard that same tone in her own voice during the worst period of her middle school experience, when well-meaning adults had made promises they couldn't keep, and offered solutions that only escalated the problems they were meant to solve. "Okay," Jessica said. "No adults, at least not yet. But you can't handle this alone." Mia turned back to her, something shifting in her expression. "Why do you want to help? You don't even know me." The question was fair, and Jessica took a moment to consider her answer. The truth was complicated, rooted in her own experiences but also in something more fundamental about the way she understood the world and her place in it. "Because I know what it's like," she said simply. "Maybe not exactly the same situation, but I know what it feels like when people decide you're fair game. I know what it's like to wake up every morning wondering what fresh hell they've planned for you." Mia studied her face, clearly evaluating her sincerity. "And you think you can help?" "I think two people standing together are harder to knock down than one person standing alone," Jessica said. "And I think Tyler Jackson isn't used to people fighting back. What you did in here, whatever it was, probably shocked him more than it hurt Austin." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Jessica's phone buzzed with a text notification. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakable. "Mind your own business, Torres. Some things aren't worth getting involved in." Jessica showed the screen to Mia, whose face went pale as she read the words. "How did they get your number so fast?" "Tyler has connections everywhere," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the chill running down her spine. "His dad owns half the businesses in town. His mom runs the PTA. His cousin works at the phone store." Another message appeared while they watched, this one containing a photo. It showed Jessica's car in the school parking lot, taken from close enough range to reveal the small dent in the rear bumper and the honor roll sticker on the back window. The implications were clear. They knew where to find her, they were watching her, and they wanted her to understand that her involvement had consequences. "This is exactly what I was talking about," Mia said, but her voice carried guilt along with frustration. "Now you're a target too." Jessica stared at the photo of her car, feeling the familiar weight of being singled out for unwanted attention. Part of her wanted to delete the messages, to pretend this conversation had never happened, to return to the safety of invisibility that had protected her since middle school. But another part of her, the part that had spent too many nights crying herself to sleep while adults offered useless advice, was tired of backing down. "Let them threaten me," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I'm tired of pretending bullies will go away if you ignore them." Mia looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You don't know what you're getting into. Tyler's family has real power. They can make your life very difficult." "They can try," Jessica said. "But I've been through difficult before. And I survived it without wire cutters or daddy's money." A third message appeared on Jessica's phone, this one brief and direct. "Last warning." Jessica read it, then deliberately deleted all 3 messages. The gesture was small but significant, a conscious rejection of intimidation, and an acceptance of whatever consequences might follow. "You're serious about this," Mia said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Dead serious," Jessica confirmed. "Whatever they're planning next, you don't have to face it alone." Mia was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with internal conflicts that Jessica could only guess at. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "There are things about me that you don't know," she said. "Things that might change your mind about helping. Try me." "I'm not helpless," Mia said carefully. "What happened here, with Austin, that wasn't luck. I knew exactly what I was doing." Jessica absorbed this information, connecting it to the precise way Mia had been standing when she first saw her, the controlled stillness that had suggested coiled energy. "You've had training." "Yes, the kind of training that lets you disable someone like Austin without breaking a sweat." "Yes." Jessica considered the implications, understanding now why Mia had seemed so calm in the aftermath of what should have been a traumatic confrontation. "But you didn't want to use it." Mia looked surprised by the observation. "How did you know that?" "Because if you wanted to hurt them, Austin would still be on the floor," Jessica said. "And Tyler and Derek would be right next to him. Whatever you know how to do, you held back." The assessment was accurate, and Mia felt something shift in her chest, some knot of tension loosening slightly. Jessica wasn't looking at her with fear or suspicion, wasn't treating her like a weapon that might go off unexpectedly. Instead, she seemed to understand the discipline required to possess dangerous skills and choose not to use them. "My mother taught me," Mia said quietly. "Before she died, she made me promise to only use what she taught me to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And you've been carrying that promise alone this whole time. It seemed like the right thing to do. Until today." Jessica's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call, rather than a text. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Jessica realized with a start that it was nearly 5 o'clock. Her mom would be getting off work soon and would expect Jessica to be home by dinner. "I have to go," Jessica said reluctantly. "But this conversation isn't over." Mia nodded, understanding the practical constraints they both faced. "Jessica, thank you for not running away." "Thank you for not letting them hurt you," Jessica replied. "See you tomorrow." As Jessica walked toward the parking lot, her mind raced with possibilities and plans. Tyler Jackson and his friends had made a mistake today, had revealed the extent of their willingness to cause serious harm. But they'd also learned that Mia Chen wasn't the easy target they'd assumed, and that discovery would change their approach in ways that were difficult to predict. The smart thing would be to stay out of it, to let Mia handle her own problems, while Jessica focused on maintaining the low profile that had kept her safe for the past 2 years. But as she reached her car and saw the dent that Tyler's message had highlighted, Jessica realized that staying safe and doing the right thing weren't always compatible choices. Her phone buzzed one more time as she started the engine. Another unknown number, another message that made her blood run cold. "Your mother works late tonight. Walks to her car alone. Shame if something happened." Jessica stared at the screen, understanding with perfect clarity that this was no longer just about high school politics or teenage conflicts. Tyler Jackson and his friends had escalated beyond threats and intimidation into territory that was genuinely dangerous. They were prepared to target family members, to use whatever leverage they could find to enforce their will. But they had also made another mistake. They had threatened the one person Jessica cared about most in the world, the woman who had supported her through her darkest period, and taught her that sometimes fighting back was the only way to survive. If Tyler thought that threatening her mother would make Jessica back down, he had seriously misunderstood who he was dealing with. Jessica saved the message instead of deleting it, then opened her contacts and scrolled to her mother's number. Elena Torres worked for the County Social Services Department, dealt with genuine predators and dangerous situations on a regular basis, and had connections throughout law enforcement and the legal system. More importantly, she had raised her daughter to understand the difference between conflicts that could be resolved through patience and diplomacy, and situations that required immediate, decisive action. This had just become the second kind of situation. And if Tyler Jackson wanted to involve family members in his power games, he was about to discover that some families knew how to fight back. Elena Torres arrived at Lincoln High School 45 minutes before the final bell, her county social services badge clipped to her blazer, and a recording device discreetly positioned in her jacket pocket. The threatening message about her evening walk had been a tactical error on Tyler Jackson's part, transforming what might have remained a teenage conflict into a matter that demanded adult intervention. Elena had dealt with enough genuine predators in her professional life to recognize the escalation pattern, and she understood that waiting for the situation to resolve itself was no longer an option. Jessica met her mother in the main office, where Principal Harris was already reviewing security footage on his computer monitor. The images were grainy but clear enough to show Austin Reed holding industrial wire cutters in a threatening posture, Tyler Jackson directing the confrontation, and Mia Chen's lightning-fast defensive movement that had disabled Austin's weapon hand. More importantly, the audio was crystal clear, capturing every word of the threats and demands that preceded the physical altercation. "This changes everything," Principal Harris said, his face grave as he paused the recording. "What we're looking at here isn't schoolyard bullying. This is assault with a weapon, criminal threatening, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm." Elena nodded, her trained eye cataloging details that spoke to premeditation and escalating violence. The wire cutters weren't improvised. This was planned, coordinated, and designed to cause serious injury. "In my professional opinion, these boys have moved beyond typical adolescent aggression into territory that requires law enforcement intervention." Officer Martinez, the school's resource officer, had been called in to view the footage and was already drafting an incident report that would trigger formal criminal charges. His 20 years of experience with juvenile offenders had taught him to recognize the difference between kids making bad choices and genuine predators in training. Tyler Jackson and his friends had crossed that line. Meanwhile, in the auto shop, Mia waited alone for whatever consequences were about to unfold. The wire cutters had been removed as evidence, but their absence somehow made the space feel more ominous rather than less. She could still feel the ghost impression of Austin's grip on her wrist, could still hear Tyler's voice promising that the confrontation was far from over. Her defensive strike had been precise and controlled, exactly the kind of measured response her mother had trained her to use, but she understood that technique and restraint might not be enough to protect her from the Jackson family's resources and influence. David Chen's meeting with Brad Jackson had lasted exactly 12 minutes, long enough for Tyler's father to make his position clear. The lease on the auto repair shop was being terminated, the building was being sold to developers, and David had 30 days to close his business and vacate the premises. No negotiation, no appeal process, no consideration for the customers who depended on his services or the life he was trying to build for his daughter. "Nothing personal," Brad Jackson had said, his smile carrying all the warmth of winter steel. "Just business. Sometimes locations become available for better uses." David had signed the termination papers because refusing would have only delayed the inevitable, while adding legal fees he couldn't afford. But as he drove back to the school to collect Mia, his hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. 30 years of honest work, of building reputation and relationships through competence and integrity, and it could all be destroyed by a phone call from someone who had never worked a day with his hands. The connection between his lease termination and whatever had happened between Mia and Tyler Jackson was too obvious to ignore. Somehow, his daughter had found herself in conflict with the most powerful family in Riverside, and the consequences were falling on both of them with the weight of inevitability. The only question now was whether there was any way to fight back or if surrender was their only option for survival. Tyler Jackson sat in his father's BMW in the school parking lot, his phone pressed to his ear as he explained the afternoon's events in carefully chosen words. Austin's injured wrist had required a trip to the emergency room, where X-rays had revealed a severe sprain that would keep him out of football practice for at least 2 weeks. Derek was spooked enough by Mia's unexpected capabilities that he was questioning whether further confrontation was wise. Most problematically, there were witnesses and security footage that could complicate any official narrative they might try to construct. "Handle it." Brad Jackson's voice came through the phone with the flat certainty of someone accustomed to making problems disappear. "Whatever it takes. That family needs to understand that there are consequences for crossing us." But Tyler was beginning to understand that handling Mia Chen might be more complicated than either he or his father had anticipated. The girl who had seemed like such easy prey just days earlier had revealed capabilities that defied everything he thought he knew about power dynamics and vulnerability. Worse, she had done it with a precision and control that suggested extensive training rather than lucky improvisation. The realization that he had seriously underestimated his target was both humiliating and genuinely frightening. Tyler had built his identity around the certainty that his family's money and influence made him untouchable, that anyone who challenged him could be crushed through economic pressure or social isolation. But Mia Chen didn't seem to operate according to those rules, and her calm response to his threats suggested she understood something about conflict that he didn't. Austin emerged from the emergency room, with his right hand immobilized in a professional brace, his face pale with pain, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. The attending physician had asked detailed questions about how the injury occurred, questions that Austin had answered with increasingly elaborate lies about sports accidents and equipment malfunctions. But the doctor's expression had suggested skepticism, and Austin worried that the medical record might become problematic if anyone started asking official questions. "We need to end this," Austin said as he climbed into the BMW's passenger seat. "That girl is dangerous. She knew exactly what she was doing." Derek nodded from the back seat, his usual swagger replaced by nervous energy. "Did you see how fast she moved? I've never seen anything like that outside of movies." Tyler's jaw tightened as he processed his friend's reactions. Fear was contagious, and if Austin and Derek started backing down, his own position would become untenable. The other students at Lincoln High were watching this confrontation carefully, measuring the relative strengths of the participants, waiting to see who would emerge victorious. Showing weakness now would undermine everything he had built, would invite challenges from every potential rival who had been waiting for an opportunity to test his dominance. "She got lucky," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Next time, we'll be ready." Austin touched his injured wrist gingerly. "Next time, maybe we should just let it go. Her family's leaving anyway, right? Your dad's handling the business side." "It's not about the business anymore," Tyler said, his voice hardening with resolve. "It's about respect. It's about making sure everyone understands what happens when someone tries to embarrass us." But even as he spoke the words, Tyler was planning his next move with more care than he had applied to the first confrontation. Mia Chen had proven that direct physical intimidation was ineffective, but there were other forms of pressure that might prove more successful. Her father's business was already being destroyed, but there were additional vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Immigration status, tax records, past legal troubles, family secrets that might be leveraged for maximum impact. The Jackson family had resources beyond what most people could imagine, connections that reached into law enforcement, government agencies, and private investigation services. If Mia Chen thought that winning one physical confrontation would end the conflict, she was about to discover how naive that assumption was. Elena Torres finished reviewing the security footage and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. The first was to Detective Sarah Williams at the Riverside Police Department, a personal friend who specialized in juvenile crimes and had extensive experience with cases involving wealthy families who thought money could buy immunity from consequences. The second call was to County Attorney Michael Rodriguez, whose office had been looking for an opportunity to address the pattern of complaints about Jackson family intimidation that never seemed to result in formal charges. The third call was to her supervisor at Social Services, initiating a protective services investigation that would examine whether Mia Chen was being adequately protected from ongoing threats. The machinery of official response was complex and sometimes slow, but once it began moving, it was very difficult to stop. Elena understood that Tyler Jackson's family would likely hire expensive lawyers and use their political connections to minimize consequences. But the security footage and witness statements created a baseline of evidence that would be hard to explain away. Meanwhile, Mia sat in the school counselor's office, answering questions about her background and family situation with careful honesty. Mrs. Patterson, the guidance counselor, was a kind woman who genuinely wanted to help, but Mia could see the limitations of what institutional support could provide. The promises of protection and intervention sounded reassuring, but they also felt fragile against the kind of resources and influence that the Jackson family could bring to bear. "The important thing is that you're safe now," Mrs. Patterson said. but her words carried the hollow ring of administrative optimism rather than practical certainty. Mia nodded politely, understanding that the counselor meant well but had no real comprehension of what they were dealing with. Tyler Jackson's threat had been explicit and credible, backed by family resources that could make problems disappear or multiply depending on their mood. The security footage might provide legal protection, but it wouldn't necessarily prevent off-campus retaliation or the kind of economic pressure that had already begun destroying her father's business. The afternoon passed in a blur of interviews, statements, and official procedures that felt both reassuring and inadequate. Elena Torres proved to be a formidable advocate, someone who understood both the legal system and the political realities that shaped how justice was administered. But even with professional support and documented evidence, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the real confrontation was still ahead of them. As the final bell rang and students began streaming toward the exits, Tyler Jackson made his decision. The official response had been faster and more comprehensive than he'd anticipated, but it was also proceeding through predictable channels that his family's lawyers could manage. What concerned him more was the loss of credibility among his peers, the way other students had started looking at him with something that might have been doubt or even amusement. Derek and Austin had abandoned him, claiming family obligations and sports commitments that conveniently kept them away from school for the remainder of the week. Without his usual support system, Tyler found himself isolated in ways he'd never experienced, forced to rely on his own resources rather than the borrowed courage that came from group intimidation. But isolation also provided clarity, and Tyler began to understand that his approach had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. He had treated Mia Chen like a typical victim, someone who could be broken through sustained pressure and escalating threats. What he should have done was research her background more thoroughly, identify her specific vulnerabilities, and attack from directions she couldn't defend against. That evening, Tyler sat in his bedroom with his laptop open, conducting the kind of detailed investigation he should have done weeks earlier. Public records, social media traces, news archives, and specialized databases that his family's money could access all began painting a picture of the Chen family's history that was far more complex than he had imagined. The Denver connection was real, but the circumstances were different from what his preliminary research had suggested. David Chen hadn't been accused of stealing from his business partner. He had been the one who discovered the theft and reported it to authorities. The resulting investigation had uncovered a network of fraud and money laundering that reached into several businesses and political organizations, making David Chen a key witness in a case that had sent 3 people to federal prison. The move to Riverside hadn't been an escape from consequences. It had been part of a witness protection arrangement that was supposed to provide safety and anonymity while David rebuilt his life. Tyler stared at the screen, understanding for the first time that he hadn't been targeting a vulnerable family trying to hide shameful secrets. He had been targeting a family that was already under federal protection, whose safety was being monitored by agencies with resources that dwarfed even the Jackson family's influence. More troubling was what he discovered about Mia herself. School records from Denver showed academic achievement that placed her in the top 5% of her class, with particular strength in mathematics and sciences. But there were also mentions of specialized training, competitive achievements in martial arts, and teacher comments that praised her discipline and self-control. One notation from her previous school's guidance counselor was particularly chilling. Student demonstrates exceptional maturity and restraint. Recommend continued monitoring to ensure she maintains healthy social connections despite advanced capabilities. Tyler closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to intimidate someone whose mother had been a competitive martial artist, whose father was a federal witness, whose family was already under the protection of agencies that could destroy the Jackson family's local influence with a few phone calls. Worse, he had done it in a way that created permanent evidence and involved multiple witnesses, ensuring that retreat would be as dangerous as continued escalation. The next morning brought developments that confirmed Tyler's worst fears. Principal Harris called an emergency assembly to address what he described as serious criminal activity that had occurred on school property. The security footage was played for the entire student body, showing Austin's threat with the wire cutters, Tyler's coordination of the attack, and Mia's precise defensive response that had prevented serious injury. But the footage had been edited to include additional context that Tyler hadn't expected. Audio from earlier confrontations, captured by hallway security cameras, revealed the pattern of escalating harassment that had preceded the wire cutter incident. Text messages obtained through court order showed the threats against Jessica Torres and her mother, providing evidence of conspiracy to intimidate witnesses. Most damaging of all was footage from the parking lot showing Tyler and his friends following Mia and David Chen, documenting stalking behavior that transformed isolated incidents into a coordinated campaign of harassment. The response from the student body was immediate and overwhelming. Spontaneous applause broke out. When the footage showed Mia's defensive technique disabling Austin's weapon, students who had witnessed previous harassment but remained silent now came forward with additional testimony. Teachers who had noticed concerning behavior patterns but hadn't known how to intervene formally requested meetings with administrators and law enforcement. Tyler found himself completely isolated, avoided by former friends who didn't want to be associated with someone under criminal investigation. The social capital he had spent years building evaporated in the space of a single morning, replaced by a mixture of fear and disgust that followed him through the hallways like a toxic cloud. Austin and Derek were arrested at their homes that afternoon, charged with assault with a weapon, criminal threatening, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. Their parents hired expensive lawyers who immediately began negotiating plea agreements that might avoid felony convictions, but the evidence was too strong and too public for the charges to simply disappear. Tyler's arrest came 2 days later, after investigators had time to build a comprehensive case that included the stalking charges and intimidation of witnesses. Brad Jackson's political connections proved insufficient to prevent the arrest, though they did ensure that Tyler was processed through the juvenile system rather than being charged as an adult. The preliminary hearing was a media spectacle that drew attention from regional news outlets and civil rights organizations. The security footage played repeatedly on local television, turning Mia's defensive technique into a symbol of resistance against bullying and intimidation. The fact that she had shown restraint, using only the minimum force necessary to protect herself, was praised by martial arts instructors and child safety advocates who understood the discipline required to possess dangerous skills and choose not to abuse them. David Chen's auto repair shop became an unexpected beneficiary of the publicity, as customers began arriving specifically because they wanted to support the family that had stood up to the Jackson family's intimidation. His appointment book filled with people who had never met him but respected what his daughter represented. The lease termination was quietly rescinded after Brad Jackson's lawyers advised him that additional retaliation might be interpreted as witness intimidation in an ongoing federal case. Elena Torres used the case as a springboard for broader reforms in how the school district handled bullying complaints, particularly those involving families with political or economic influence. Her presentation to the school board, accompanied by security footage and witness testimony, resulted in new protocols that required external review of any case involving potential criminal activity. Jessica Torres found herself thrust into a leadership role she hadn't expected, coordinating with other students to document patterns of harassment that had previously been ignored or minimized. Her careful documentation and willingness to testify publicly inspired other victims to come forward, creating a comprehensive picture of systemic problems that went far beyond the specific incident with Mia Chen. The most significant change occurred in Mia herself. The confrontation had forced her to integrate the different aspects of her identity, to find a way to honor her mother's teachings, while also protecting herself and her father in a complex and sometimes hostile world. She began teaching basic self-defense classes at the community center, sharing not just physical techniques, but the philosophical framework that governed their use. Her first class had 8 students, mostly girls from Lincoln High, who had heard about her story and wanted to learn how to protect themselves. By the end of the month, she was teaching 3 different sessions to accommodate demand from both teenagers and adults who were tired of feeling vulnerable to people who mistook kindness for weakness. "The goal isn't to hurt people," Mia explained to her students during one session. The goal is to make sure that people who want to hurt you understand that there will be consequences for their choices. The lesson resonated far beyond the physical techniques she demonstrated. Her students learned not just how to break grips and escape holds, but how to carry themselves with confidence, how to recognize dangerous situations before they escalated, and most importantly, how to understand the difference between being peaceful and being helpless. Tyler Jackson's family quietly left Riverside 6 months after the trial, relocating to another state where Brad Jackson's construction company could operate without the stigma of criminal charges and federal investigation. The family's political influence had been permanently damaged by the publicity surrounding the case, and several business partners had ended their relationships rather than risk association with someone whose son had been convicted of assault with a weapon. Tyler himself was sentenced to 18 months in a juvenile detention facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and mandatory anger management counseling. The experience was humbling in ways that his privileged upbringing had never allowed, forcing him to confront the reality that actions had consequences regardless of family wealth or political connections. Austin and Derek received lighter sentences through plea agreements, but both were expelled from Lincoln High and required to complete their education through alternative programs. Austin's football career was permanently ended by both his criminal record and the injury to his wrist, which never fully healed to its previous strength. Derek's family moved him to a private school in another district, hoping that distance and time might allow him to rebuild his reputation. The changes at Lincoln High went beyond the removal of Tyler and his friends. The security footage had revealed systematic failures in adult supervision and intervention that allowed harassment to escalate unchecked. New policies required immediate investigation of any allegations involving weapons or physical threats, with mandatory reporting to law enforcement for cases involving potential criminal activity. More importantly, the culture of the school began to shift, as students realized that speaking up about harassment could lead to real consequences for perpetrators. The code of silence that had protected bullies like Tyler Jackson crumbled under the weight of documented evidence and professional investigation. Mia's final act in the transformation of Lincoln High was a presentation she gave to incoming freshmen about recognizing and responding to bullying behavior. Standing on the same stage where Principal Harris had shown the security footage of her confrontation with Tyler, she spoke about the importance of understanding your own capabilities and the responsibility that came with possessing skills that could hurt others. Strength isn't about being able to hurt people, she told the audience of nervous 14-year-olds. Real strength is about protecting people who can't protect themselves, including protecting bullies from the consequences of their own worst impulses. The presentation was recorded and shared with other schools throughout the region, becoming part of anti-bullying curricula that emphasized both personal empowerment and social responsibility. Mia's story became a teaching tool that helped other students understand that being a victim wasn't inevitable, but that choosing to fight back required wisdom and restraint, rather than just anger and aggression. As her senior year approached, Mia received acceptance letters from several universities that had heard about her story and were impressed by both her academic achievements and her community leadership. She chose Colorado State University, where she planned to study social work, with a focus on youth advocacy and violence prevention. David Chen's auto repair business thrived in ways he had never expected, fueled by customers who appreciated both his technical skills and his family's courage in standing up to intimidation. He hired 2 additional mechanics and expanded into motorcycle repair, building the kind of sustainable business he had always dreamed of owning. The Federal Witness Protection Program was officially concluded, but David chose to remain in Riverside rather than relocate again. The community that had initially seemed hostile had become genuinely welcoming once people understood the truth about his family's background and character. Elena Torres was promoted to Regional Supervisor for Child Protective Services, in part because of her effective handling of the Chen case and her advocacy for policy reforms that better protected vulnerable families from retaliation. She continued to work closely with schools and law enforcement to identify and address situations where family wealth or political influence might interfere with appropriate intervention. Jessica Torres graduated as valedictorian of her class and received a full scholarship to study journalism at the University of Colorado. Her senior project was a comprehensive investigation of how bullying cases were handled differently depending on the socioeconomic status of the families involved. research that contributed to state-level policy discussions about equal protection under anti-harassment laws. The wire cutters that had been intended to mutilate Mia's fingers were eventually destroyed as evidence, but their symbolic power lived on in the way that students and faculty talked about the importance of recognizing when conflicts crossed the line from ordinary adolescent friction into genuine criminal behavior. Lincoln High School's auto shop was renovated and expanded, becoming a state-of-the-art facility that attracted students interested in automotive technology and mechanical engineering. A small plaque near the entrance commemorated the importance of creating safe learning environments where all students could pursue their education without fear of harassment or intimidation. 5 years later, Mia returned to Riverside as a licensed social worker specializing in youth violence prevention. Her first assignment was developing programming for at-risk teenagers, many of whom reminded her of Tyler Jackson before his choices led him down a path that destroyed his future prospects. She often thought about the promise she had made to her mother, and how the events at Lincoln High had forced her to understand that protecting people sometimes required using the very skills she had hoped never to need. The balance between strength and restraint remained delicate, but she had learned that true wisdom lay not in avoiding difficult choices, but in making them with full awareness of their consequences. The community center where she taught self-defense classes had grown into a comprehensive youth services facility that provided counseling, academic support, and conflict resolution training for teenagers throughout the region. Her approach, emphasizing personal empowerment within a framework of social responsibility, had become a model that other communities sought to replicate. Tyler Jackson, meanwhile, completed his probation and enrolled in community college under a different name, hoping to rebuild his life away from the shadow of his teenage crimes. The experience of being powerless and vulnerable had taught him lessons that his privileged upbringing had never provided, though whether those lessons would translate into genuine personal growth remained to be seen. As Mia walked through the halls of Lincoln High during a visit to speak with current students, she reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon in the auto shop, when she had been forced to choose between her mother's promise and her family's safety. The choice had seemed impossible at the time, but she had learned that the most important promises were not the ones that were easy to keep, but the ones that required wisdom and courage to fulfill properly. The wire cutters were gone, but the lesson they represented lived on, that strength without wisdom was just violence waiting to happen, but that wisdom without strength was just philosophy that couldn't protect the people who needed protection most. Finding the balance between those truths had been the real education that Lincoln High had provided, far more valuable than anything she could have learned from textbooks or lectures. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.